Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. You will hear from industry leaders covering innovative, cutting-edge business, learning, and HR topics that weave current market research and technology into each episode. Our Excellence at Work podcast is hosted by Brandon Hall Group's Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. Today we have with us Harper Wells, Chief Compliance Officer from Learning Pool. Hi Harper, how are you?
Hi, thank you. Doing great. So great to be here with you today.
So great to have you. And just to share with everyone, thank you all for joining us as well. And a little bit about Harper. She is an industry expert who is passionate about building progressive, outcome-driven ethics and compliance programs. Harper Wells serves as the Chief Compliance Officer, as I just mentioned, at Learning Pool. She oversees the company's ethics and compliance program and helps over 1,400 organizations around the world, including leading Fortune 500 organizations, transform their program strategy by leveraging technology and behavioral analytics. And prior to joining Learning Pool, she has spent over 15 years in compliance, risk, and governance roles across heavily regulated industries. So Harper brings a lot of insight and a wealth of knowledge and experience to our conversation today. And today we're going to be talking about really empowering corporate culture and change through diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before we dive into our discussion, I do want to just give a couple of accolades to Learning Pool. They've received 4 awards from Brandon Hall Group in 2021, 2 in HCM Learning and Development, and 2 in Excellence in Tech, the Future of Work. So congratulations there. And we've also have collaborated with them on a number of different initiatives, from webinars. We are going to be conducting a webinar with them coming up on September 7th, focused on learning analytics from inception to maturity. So if you enjoyed today's discussion, which I hope you do and learn a lot from, or some key takeaways, please also tune in to the webinar coming up on the 7th. And then we have a couple of research reports too to share with you that you can access through the blog and through the episode or our executive interview around inclusion, culture and inclusion, measurement, driving diversity, equity, and inclusion impact, and 3 imperatives for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2022. So lots of material here for you to review and to just gain some insights around, how you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how to create a culture, a better impact. I know there's a lot of talk about empowering corporate culture and change through diversity, equity, inclusion, but how do we get there? And how can organizations create inclusive cultures rather than just talking about it? And I think this is a great time, or Harper, if you can just, lead us off here, and why is inclusivity not an option anymore?
Yeah, thanks for all that. And we're so happy about our achievements and our awards and our partnerships with you and all of the tools and resources that we can give to all of our peers across the globe. So thanks again for having me. We're seeing clear signals across verticals that inclusivity is no longer a nice to have, but something really that organizations must be prioritizing. We're seeing a lot of flares being sent up here, but 3 areas we're constantly seeing send up flares, are first in the war for talent. So in this work climate, data is telling us that employees are no longer putting up with companies who do not prioritize DE&I and who don't make ethical behavior a priority. Interestingly, there was a recent MIT Sloan survey of 34 million US workers who left their jobs between April and September 2021, so a really tight time frame. And this survey found that the top reasons that people left their roles were toxic corporate culture and non-inclusive work environments. And especially now, with hybrid and remote work environments here to stay, people's careers aren't limited to their geographical area. So they are more inclined to leave and go find work elsewhere. The other thing we're seeing is conscious investing. So according to figures put out by Gartner earlier this year, mentions of diversity on earnings calls skyrocketed by 658% between Q1 2018 and Q1 2021. So you've got 88% of companies featuring equity in their values, and you've got chief inclusion or diversity, or call it what you may, these officers coming in to emerge and act on these social and political issues. And then thirdly, you've got ESG-focused consumers. So data is continually telling us that ethical companies outperform their peers. So we're seeing clear signals that the modern consumer also is much more cautious about who they support with their own financial capital.
All good and relevant data points, and we see, in our research, we've done a study earlier this year just to kind of gauge, what companies are doing and how they are prioritizing around DE&I, and where we see that companies they know that it's important and that they know that they should, and some companies are, and they are, ahead even prior to the pandemic. However, there's still more than half of organizations that don't really have strategic plans in place. And, so how do there's so much awareness around this. How do we move that needle forward?
Yeah, that's such a great point. Change always takes time, and people, organizations, they do have the best intentions, but if you look at the research that's out there, like you've done, we've also recently released a paper on this, empowering corporate culture change through DE&I. The needle hasn't moved much, sadly. It's moved, but it's not moved as much as we wanted it to. We're still missing the boat on finding ways to truly weave DE&I within the fabric of our organizations and how we do business. And the reason we see this movement, but not enough, is because of the breakdown in how we're trying to achieve results in the space. So you see a lot of organizations still focus largely on awareness and not individual action. So, for example, if I asked any organization today, and I, speaking with, irrespective of industry vertical, I speak with organizations, how diverse and inclusive do you think you are really? They'll probably give me some HR metrics like demographics breakdowns, or they may point to their board or governance metrics like their compositions on their board. But what they won't be able to tell me is what's the cultural baseline in their company. So at Max, they may have done some cultural surveys, some anonymous surveys, which can give you some real false positives and negatives depending on your work culture and how inclusive people actually think the organization is. So we're seeing sets of activities happening. Most frequently, we see organizations trying to move the needle by relying on these HR metrics like your employee composition or demographics as a measure of DEI health, which is a little dangerous to do just in a silo. We see also more of a reactionary approach like inviting a speaker or a live training equivalent in, but that's really all they do. And we do see a lot of organizations mandating training, DE&I or unconscious bias training, but you're seeing training focusing on types of biases and not how to effectively spot and interrupt them. So we don't really have clear measurement beyond HR metrics, and companies aren't baselining individuals on their readiness to be inclusive. We just aren't using enough data intelligence, so we really don't know what to improve and where. And when you talk about culture, no company is a universal culture. You can have hundreds of microcultures across your organization, so the same tactic won't work to improve all of them. They're really each on their own path, and what you do might be drastically different, and they may be on a different spectrum in becoming truly inclusive. So our world today, as we see it in learning tech, is more of this one-way feed where we keep pushing out awareness, but there really isn't this true feedback loop that we need on how people actually feel. So it really starts with understanding that at the root of it, it's in the actions and behaviors of each and every one of us in our everyday as a collective.
And we know that taking action is important. The awareness is we are aware of that, and I think the awareness of it has been brought to the surface. and even more so after the last couple of years. And so how do we move past just the awareness and really take action?
Yeah, definitely. It's so cliche. I use this kind of quote all the time, but it's the most basic principle, and that's you can't manage what you can't measure. I think Carl Drucker is just re-quoted and retweeted more than he would ever have imagined. But technology has evolved significantly here in creating really powerful ways to assess each employee's readiness and give organizations actionable insight on what strategy should be for different parts of your organization. So, an often ignored way to be able to use this type of data intelligence is to change how you're actually training. I'm not talking about the click next lectures, where employees are just like trying to get through it, or this, a heartfelt recount from someone's personal experiences, which we've all heard and can be incredibly powerful and introspective. I'm talking about using technology to simulate real life situations and having that provide you data on how employees react and how they navigate situations. But one of the very first things that's required to be able to drive to that positive change outcome and to move the needle in the DEI world is the willingness, the empowerment, and most importantly, the skill to have those difficult conversations. But how do you do that? How do you interrupt a moment of bias in a constructive and effective way? So have your employees had enough practice to feel comfortable doing that in real life? Or are we just sitting here telling them, you need to not be biased. Bias needs to be eliminated, which is much easier said than done, as we all know. There needs to be a path to getting people skillfully comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. And it's really fundamentally because the human brain makes decisions based on these neural pathways and schemas. And a lot of us call these things like just habits. And we need to create new muscle memory for navigating these situations. So when you talk about neural pathways and schemas, and when you think about it, many of us have instinctive responses. We just see things in our lives and we almost go on autopilot. You don't even think about it. And those reactions have become this way because we've gone through this action perception cycle so many times that if something happens or some situation comes in front of you, you behave a certain way, that behavior becomes validated, and then you just keep going through it. And the irony is that you can make that cycle happen in real life through these scenarios and how we all react, but you can also make that cycle happen artificially through simulation. And we've seen this across the military or pilots or any sort of crisis management. They all operate in this way in order to have people go through this action perception loop. And this is where tech comes in, right? So humanized scenario-based simulation, this is what creates a safe space for employees to practice, for pilots to practice, for military to practice, for athletes to practice. And they continuously challenge or extend their current schemas until the action becomes almost like a reflex or a gut reaction. And this may be different depending on your upbringing, depending on your environment. Each person may need a little bit more or a different amount of coaching. And this is why when you see organizations trying to drive DEI forward, one size fits all doesn't work. But obviously not to stress, because you've got the technology that's evolved to make training adaptive, where it continues to change your content, the sequence, the assessment based on how each individual employee is actually navigating through this. And it gives them their own journey, really, to master situations and either create new or reinforce neural pathways.
Fascinating. And when you take a look at some of the simulations and the environments, the artificial environments that are made available, you do see how people have that anxiety or are triggered. And in the way that they are triggered, everybody is wired differently in how they react, and having these environments to do this in a safe place and test out and really kind of change their behavior. It's so instrumental in going from awareness to action oriented or behavioral change. And so what role does leadership play using this technology and making progress?
Right. And you're so right about, by the way, just reinforcing that cycle, right? In a meeting where you constantly, as an example, see an employee being cut down or ignored or not listened to, what can you do in these situations? With safe simulation and practice, are you going to stand up to everyone in the room and say, you're all terrible, you're not listening to this person and they've got great ideas too? You're not going to do that, because that actually goes against our values of respectful workplace and such. You need to get into a situation where you feel comfortable just interrupting that moment and being an ally to another colleague to say, hey, you know what? I think this person had something to say over here. Let's go back. Can you just say your point again? And it's in the smallest ways that you can do that. And when you talk about leadership, it can't be understated enough, and I'm sure you've seen this as well in the research, they are the cornerstone to putting the technology and data to use. So if you look at the role of leaders, and I can't help it, I was a psych major in college, but you just need to look at the Milgram experiment or the social conformity bias experiments to reinforce that we as humans, we are highly susceptible to mirroring our environment, and especially those with authority. So leaders really need to take a cue here and buy in with their actions and not just their words and statements. They truly need to understand the business case, surround themselves with the appropriate stakeholders, and define how DE&I fits into their organization's mission, vision, and values, and then use that to commit to a well-designed DEI strategy. And also with that DEI strategy comes the psychological safety for people to feel comfortable speaking up and how they feel that DEI fits into your organization and how it should be communicated out, and what tools and resources and what types of activities you should be doing. And the strategy needs to go beyond HR systems. It needs to focus on training and awareness of everyone in order to kind of bring that DEI vision to life and build a more embedded culture. So when it comes to data, leaders should be demanding this type of data. They should be demanding predictive data rather than just hindsight data and these hindsight demographic metrics to commit to this strategy. And by leveraging behavioral insights or the decisions and the journeys that employees are making through this training, they can devise the right strategy based on their organization to help eliminate maybe some inaction or apathy they may be seeing. Because we can all sit there in a leader's town hall or some sort of speech, and the person is saying, DEI is really important to us here. We need to be more focused on DE&I. And what happens, right? All of us nod our heads. And everyone's like, yeah, you're right, we do. And nothing really changes the way we expect it to, despite everyone's best intentions, as we were talking about earlier. But if that leader came in saying like, hey, 25% of us thinks it's okay to use this type of language, well then, why do you think that is? That really changes things, right? It becomes my friend has a problem type situation. Why do you think this is? And someone may say, well, maybe it's because of this, or maybe it's because of that. This is what's opening up to a dialogue here. So like all tools, you've got a bunch of tools across your organization. How you put them to use is really what is going to deliver the impact here. So behavioral insights from training are no different. Having them is like this first step, but reviewing those patterns and trends to identify maybe where line managers may be driving their own values that aren't necessarily in alignment with your organization's, or benchmarking the readiness across your organization. It's critical that leaders do this and ensure it happens, so that once everyone can rally around this defined problem statement, leaders can then give their all the personnel, their managers and their employees, an array of tools and resources and learning pathways to tackle biases in e-learning, whether that's through training, whether that's through group discussions, whether that's through employee resource groups or affinity groups. But also you want to give people self-study to be able to pull down in order to drive effectiveness and continuous improvement. So having a commitment to DE&I, like you're saying, a lot of these organizations have a commitment. It's only the beginning of the story. Leaders need to be constantly communicating their vision. They need to utilize a measurable framework that can be rolled out across the broader company, and then they need to focus on an array of different tactics, including adaptive training, leadership, manager, employee engagement, in addition to these systems, processes, and controls they've put into place. Don't get me wrong, these HR systems are absolutely needed to monitor equity and inclusivity and things like tracking demographics, composition. They definitely help. And a lot of organizations do need to report on these things, but bringing in a diverse set of individuals into the door is just the start. It's what happens after they get into the door, and whether they feel supported and like they can bring their authentic selves to work and like they feel like they have an opportunity for advancement. So if you want to move the needle on culture, the change really begins with every employee learning a little bit about themselves and each other, through careful self-analysis and safe practice and that continual reinforcement. So it's about how being diverse, equitable, and inclusive is better for each of us, and getting to a place where at a minimum they can tie it to a fundamental business practice and is part of their own contribution to the organization's goals. Because if you can't do that, it'll always feel foreign or just like an empty value statement in the company's values in the code that's collecting dust up on the shelf. That global trust index that I mentioned earlier shows that companies with higher trust have outperformed their peers for over 10 years. So leaders need to take a cue and know that they need to do this not just because it's the right thing to do, but they need to do this because it's also the right thing to do to drive to extraordinary outcomes for their own company, right? The end of the day, the culture at these organizations is just kind of this collection of what's acceptable, and what the majority chooses to do there. So leadership does have a unique opportunity to be able to drive accountability and insight here individually and as a collective. And I'm not trying to put rose colored or however you call it glasses on. The needle will never move as fast as we want it to, but we feel like the more data, the more insights, the more action focused you can be, and the more leadership is holding accountable to the strategy, and holding accountable to their employees and making that meaningful to them. That's when the faster change comes in.
And you mentioned a lot around reflection and self-awareness and self-assessment, and that is so important so that leaders can grow and they can make changes. And then you have different sets of leadership in the organization. You have the higher leaders, and then you have mid, and so you have different cultures or subcultures in an organization. But the true culture is driven from the top, and you want to ensure that messaging is cascaded throughout, and that whoever you bring on from at whatever level is aligned to that brand and is aligned to the vision of the leaders, and creating this type of environment where you're creating true inclusion, where everyone feels like that they do belong, and they're there, and they are part of the the overall culture, where they're being heard and their decisions are being considered, and they can make change. And this is not just so that they feel good, but it just, as you mentioned earlier, that companies will outperform and they will serve their communities better and they will develop better products because they have a diverse perspective, and they're making decisions that are inclusive of their communities, of their people in their company, of the clients that they serve. So it's this evolving, we're in this big circle together.
I know, and you mentioned that it's so important, reaffirming about leadership and cascading that message down. We often talk about the tone at the top of an organization and the actions at the top of the organization, but we want to be able to feed that mood in the middle. And those managers and supervisors who are seen as the direct line, and they are seen as the leadership to a lot of personnel underneath them. A lot of employees are disconnected from their C-suite leaders, so they see their supervisor, they may work off-site or across the country or across the globe. Their supervisor is that person who is setting the values and setting the expectations, right? So we need to make sure not only are we arming our leadership, but we're also arming our managers to be able to drive this two-way dialogue and efficacy here.
And this is where analytics and technology come into a big play, because you can use the data, you can use the insights, feedback, engagement surveys, multitude of different levels of data to help you shape your decisions of where some of the issues may be, or some of the the not just issues, but also what's working and how you can continue that experience across other functions or teams. So you can use it in a constructive way to make improvements, but also to validate what's working. And yeah.
Absolutely. And you certainly can't just think that you're going to put out some form of e-learning and move the needle, and the initiative then becomes over and you've succeeded at what you've wanted to succeed. Like you mentioned, this is something that requires so many different levers across the organization. So it's not only e-learning, it's, yes, looking at employee decisions through learning and using those behavioral insights to specifically target your organization and not be, have these broad swaths of DEI as where we need to go and is the future, but what is actually happening underneath your nose at your organization. But you've got to have the composition, you've got to have the monitoring in place, you've got to have your ambassadors out there. And companies are really looking to take note, they are looking to move in the right direction. And I think that the companies that are willing to take this data-driven approach and take this strategic approach like you mentioned earlier, putting strategic plans in place, and actually living up to those plans, those are the companies that you're going to see moving forward. We definitely see some superstar companies out there right now.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good way to wrap up for today is, keep keep striving and making improvements, and however, wherever you are in the journey, if you're just getting started, or you're along more of you're more along the path than others, there's always opportunities for improvement. And I think where we have seen in the past, especially when companies are, where we see just diversity training as not being effective, one of the least effective training deliveries or programs, is when it's just a program. And it really needs to be part of your strategy, embedded in your talent and learning decisions, and across each level and person leader of the company. Harper, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing your experience, your expertise. It was you provided a lot of great insight, and we could talk forever. So, but
Absolutely.
But please also stay tuned for the upcoming webinar with our team and their team on measurement and analytics. They'll be sharing a lot more good information. And we have a lot of interesting things ahead this remaining this part of the year. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
And thanks so much again for having me.
It's been a pleasure.